They stood and clapped. Everyone. Loud and proud, right in the middle of my retirement party. But it wasn't for me. It was for my brother and his book. 33 years of service, and I didn't even get a name tag spelled right. Hi, I'm Elaine. I spent my whole adult life taking care of others, at work, at home, in silence, and when it was finally my turn to be celebrated, I was erased right in front of the cake. But what happened next? That's when everything started to change. Before we dive into the story, let me learn a bit about you. If you're a charming lady, please leave the number 1 in the comments. And if you're a dashing gentleman, leave the number 2. This way, I can send you a special greeting. Now let's start the story together. They stood and clapped. Not for me. Not for the woman who had given 33 years to public health, who had spent weekends reviewing clinic audits and weeknights calming anxious staff during flu outbreaks. They clapped for my brother, for Caleb, standing on that makeshift stage with a book in his hand and a grin like he'd just won something bigger than an ovation. I adjusted my shawl and glanced at the sparkling cider, sweating in my plastic flute. I didn't stand. I couldn't. My legs might have carried me to hundreds of policy meetings over the years, but they wouldn't have carried me through this applause. It was a small community hall in Portland. Neutral carpet, folding chairs, a slide projector that hummed louder than the jazz playing in the background. The food was laid out nicely. Crustless cucumber sandwiches, cheese cubes, and lemon bars wrapped in wax paper. I had helped pick it all, though you'd never guess that from how the program read. It listed special thanks to the department's event planner and to Caleb for creative contribution. No mention of me, the retiree. Martha, my mother, sat in the front row, dabbing the corners of her eyes with a folded tissue. She was dressed in a pale lilac sweater that I'd given her 2 Christmases ago, still with the price tag attached when she opened it. I never brought it up. That was the way things had always been. When I won a citywide award for clinic expansion, she said, "That's sweet," and then asked if Caleb was still writing poetry. Dr. Reyes stood behind the podium now, clearing his throat and tapping the mic like it was a prop he didn't quite trust. "Before we close today's program," he said, "we're honored to hear from someone who has been deeply inspired by Elaine's legacy, her own brother, Caleb Whitmore." The room shifted. Some heads turned to look at me. I smiled, nodded like this was expected. It wasn't. Nina, sitting beside me, raised her eyebrow just slightly. I shook my head once, slow, to tell her it was fine, that I was fine. Caleb jogged up the steps like a man younger than 44, one hand tucked inside his blazer pocket, the other gripping a copy of his new memoir. "I wasn't planning to speak," he began, "but watching this beautiful tribute today reminded me how stories start, with people like my sister." I exhaled. Maybe this would be okay. But he didn't say my name, not once. Instead, he launched into an excerpt about our childhood, about our mother raising 2 very different children, one careful, one curious. The audience laughed when he described building a treehouse and falling through the floorboards. Mom laughed too, covering her mouth like it was the first time she'd heard that story. I sat perfectly still. My name tag was slightly crooked. It also said Elaine Whitman, not Whitmore. Close enough to ignore, but far enough to make a point. The slideshow cycled through behind him. Pictures of department volunteers, city events, and finally a snapshot of Caleb holding his book next to Mom, both beaming. There wasn't a single photo of me, not from work, not from home. When Caleb finished, the applause was louder than before. Mom stood up. Others followed. A few people glanced my way again, as if waiting for me to stand too, to join the clapping. I smiled and reached for my drink. The condensation had pooled around the base of the cup, soaking into the corner of the program folded on my lap. I thought I'd be angry, but what I felt was stranger, like I was fading into wallpaper, present, patterned, and completely ignored. Dr. Reyes returned to the mic. "Let's have one last round of applause for Elaine Whitmore, for her decades of service and for, well, raising such an eloquent brother." It was meant to be charming. I smiled again. As the room buzzed with chatter and people gathered their coats, I stayed seated. Nina leaned in and whispered, "Do you want to get out of here?" I shook my head. "No," I said quietly. "Let's give it a minute." Because I needed that minute to gather the pieces, to swallow the ache. I looked down at the plate in front of me. My lemon bar sat untouched. Someone had placed a decorative toothpick in the center. I pulled it out and laid it gently on my napkin, like I was undoing something delicate. Then, as Caleb mingled by the buffet, signing programs and posing for selfies, I raised my glass and held it toward him. "To you," I whispered, though no one heard it. Of course. I wondered then, not for the first time, if anyone noticed how tightly I was holding the glass, or whether my hand, polished and steady for 3 decades of medical briefings, had finally begun to tremble. I never kept score, until it became clear no one else was keeping track. The apartment was quiet except for the slow tick of the rain tapping the window and the low hum of my old radiator kicking in and out. I had changed out of the navy dress and into flannel pajamas, the kind with the little buttons that never lined up right. A glass of red wine sat on the coffee table, breathing. I hadn't touched it. I kept telling myself I would. I just hadn't yet. My laptop sat open on the dining table. The screen cast a dull glow across the room, the light flickering every few seconds like it was blinking at me. I moved the mouse. The spreadsheet appeared, the familiar grid of dates and amounts lined up neatly like soldiers on inspection. The file was labeled Support 2017 to now.xlsx. I'd created it years ago, thinking it might help me track a few things, just until things got sorted. I clicked the first tab, Caleb Housing, rent payments, $950 here, $875 there. A one-time help from 2019 that became 3 more transfers in 2020. Tuition support, partial semester here, community college refund there, the printing deposit for his self-published poetry zine. That one made me pause. He had promised to reimburse that one within a month. I hovered over the cell. The note still popped up. Book will sell, I swear. Another tab, Mom Utilities. Cell phone, water, a 3-month stretch where I paid the gas bill because she said the furnace was acting up again. I had forgotten about the grocery stipends during Caleb's writing sabbatical. The total at the bottom of the final tab, $91,280.12. I leaned back, the chair creaking beneath me. I rubbed my eyes, then reached for my glass and finally took a sip. It was too warm now, dulled around the edges. I took another anyway. Somewhere in the hallway, I heard a gentle knock, soft, like someone wasn't sure whether to interrupt. I opened the door and found Grace standing there, holding a Tupperware container wrapped in a kitchen towel. "Lentil soup," she said, her smile small and kind. "With rosemary. You looked like you might need something warm." "I didn't even know I looked like anything," I said, and stepped aside. She came in without fuss. We sat at the table without turning on more lights. Just the laptop's glow and the overhead bulb in the kitchen, casting long shadows across the wood floor. Grace didn't ask what I was working on. She never did. That's what I appreciated about her. She handed me the container, then placed a folded piece of paper beside it. "What's that?" "A poem," she said. "I wrote it years ago, never showed it to anyone. Felt silly, but you look like someone who doesn't mind words." I glanced at the page. The title was handwritten in soft pencil. Quiet Wait. I didn't read it yet. I just let it sit there. "I used to be the fixer in my family," Grace said, sipping from her thermos. "At first, it felt like love. Later, it started to feel like labor." "That's exactly it," I said, a little too fast. "You do it out of care. Then suddenly it's expected, then required, and then you're not a person anymore. You're a resource." Grace nodded. "There's a difference between being generous and being mined." I turned back to the screen. The spreadsheet stared back, sterile and efficient. I clicked the file name. The cursor blinked in the box. I deleted the word support. For a second, I couldn't type anything else. The silence in the room thickened. Then I wrote, "Debt." I hit save. The screen didn't protest. No pop-up warning. No, "Are you sure?" It just accepted it. "Dear friend, what would you do if you were in my shoes? I bet you can't guess what's coming next. But before we go any further, drop a 5 in the comments if you're still with me, because what happens next might just leave you speechless." I felt Grace watching me, not judging, just understanding. "You've done a lot," she said gently, "but you're allowed to do less now." I nodded. My chest tightened, not from pain, but from release. There's a moment sometimes when something small changes and you know nothing will ever quite be the same again. It doesn't come with thunder or applause, just a single click in a quiet kitchen and a name change on a file that had never told the whole story anyway. I closed the laptop slowly, as if sealing something away. The room felt different, not lighter exactly, but rearranged. Grace stood and reached for her coat. "Read the poem when you're ready," she said. "Or don't. Either way, it's yours now." I walked her to the door. Before she stepped out, she turned back. "You know," she said, "sometimes the only way to make space for your voice is to stop echoing theirs." I didn't answer. I just closed the door gently behind her and stood there for a moment, listening to the rain pick up again. Back at the table, I looked at the poem, still folded. I didn't open it yet. I looked at the screen, the file now renamed. I stared at the new file name like it might bite me, but it didn't. It just waited. The kettle was nearly whistling when my phone buzzed on the counter. I didn't reach for it. I turned the flame down instead, watching the little white puff of steam curl up against the kitchen window. The glass was fogged from the inside, softening the outline of the neighbor's maple tree, already half bare. Another reminder that fall had come and gone faster than I realized. The phone buzzed again. I glanced at the screen. "Mom." No picture, just her name and that worn-out ringtone I'd never changed. I let it ring until it stopped. 15 years. That's how long temporary had lasted. The first time I sent money, it was because she'd missed a bill and didn't want the lights shut off. Then came Caleb's tuition, then groceries, then a little something for the holidays. At some point, it just became automatic, literally. I poured the water into my mug. The scent of Earl Grey floated up. I took my time adding milk, stirred, then walked to the table and sat down. A yellow legal pad waited there, half covered in notes. One line read, "Cancel auto." Another, "Redirect savings." In the corner, circled twice. "Lisbon?" I picked up the phone and opened the voicemail. Mom's voice played in that controlled, soft tone she used when she needed something but didn't want to seem like she did. "Hi, sweetheart, it's me. The water heater's gone out again. I don't want to bother you. I know you're busy with all the retirement stuff. But it's getting cold and your brother's been trying to fix it, but, well, you know how he is with tools. Anyway, if you could take a look when you have a chance. I think the plumber said it's about $480. Love you." The message ended with a short pause. I imagined her standing in the kitchen, finger still hovering over the end button, waiting to hear her own voice echo back. But there was no echo. Just me, alone, in my kitchen, holding a mug and a decision. I set the phone down without responding. I opened my laptop and logged into the banking app. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. The numbers blinked softly. There it was. Scheduled transfer. Whitmore Household Utilities. $400. Recurring monthly. I had seen that screen 100 times, but never as a choice, always as a given. The little icon spun as the page loaded. I felt the knot in my chest rise and settle again. Then the phone rang. Different ringtone. Brighter. Shorter. I answered. "Elaine?" "Nina," I said, and my voice sounded steadier than I expected. "Did I catch you at a good time?" I'm staring at my bank account, deciding whether or not to press a very final button. She laughed gently. "Sounds important." "It is, or at least it finally feels that way." There was a pause. Then she said, "I wanted to ask you something. We're starting a writing circle at the library. Just a few of us. Nothing formal. You don't have to bring anything or even read aloud if you don't want to. But I don't know. I thought of you." "Me?" I said, surprised. "I know you've always kept things inside. That doesn't mean you don't have something to say." I stared at the screen again. The words "cancel auto transfer" sat in the corner, like a dare. "Your story isn't over," Nina added, her voice soft. "It just hasn't been told right yet." I didn't answer. Not right away. I clicked the cancel button. No warning, no dramatic sound effect, just a small green check mark. Done. "Elaine?" Nina asked. "I'm here," I said. "Still here." There was another pause. This time it felt warm. "So, Thursday evening?" she said. "I'll think about it." Good. That's all I wanted. After we hung up, I sat still for a while. I sipped my tea. The steam brushed my chin, then my cheek. I held the mug with both hands like I was anchoring myself to something small and real. The money had always gone out with so little resistance. A line item, a favor, a promise that felt like a requirement. And now, just like that, it stopped. I didn't call Mom back. I didn't explain. I didn't say, "Next month, maybe." For the first time in years, I did nothing. And somehow it felt like everything. I took the yellow pad and scratched out the top line. Cancel Auto now had a thick black line through it. Underneath it, I wrote, "Confirmed." Then, below Lisbon, I drew a small check mark, just a tiny one. I didn't know when or how, but for the first time in a long while, I knew I wasn't going to keep putting it off. When I stood up, the fog on the window had started to clear. The tree outside still had one stubborn golden leaf clinging to its branch. I watched it for a while, thinking maybe it would fall, but it didn't. Not yet, and neither did I. The book was in the staff picks section, facing outward between a debut thriller and a memoir by a chef who'd survived addiction and turned her pain into recipes. Caleb's title was printed in warm serif letters, The Dreamer's House. The cover was soft blue, like faded denim, and showed a watercolor image of their childhood home, complete with the ivy-covered porch I used to sweep every Sunday. I reached for it without hesitation, not out of curiosity, but because I already knew I wouldn't buy it. The bookstore was quiet that morning. Rain tapped the skylights above the main floor, and a few college students whispered near the poetry shelves. A barista called out a name that wasn't mine. I tugged my scarf a little tighter and flipped the book open, right to the chapter I knew would sting. Chapter 5, The House That Raised Us. The line came quickly, near the top of the second page. My sister was present but distant, kind, responsible, but always a little apart. You could count on her to handle the chores, but not the magic. I didn't underline it with a pen, just pressed my thumbnail hard into the paper, leaving a faint crescent mark beside the sentence. I had made the lunches, paid for his textbooks, showed up at every event he almost forgot. That wasn't magic, I supposed, just maintenance. A clerk passed by and gave me a polite nod. "That one's flying off the shelves," she said, gesturing to the book in my hand. "He's local, right?" "Mm-hmm," I replied. She moved on. I turned to the acknowledgments page, though I already knew. Thanks to Mom for teaching us how to dream. To Mr. Sandoval, my high school English teacher. To all the readers who reminded me that stories are our truest homes. That was it. No mention of me. The woman who made his dreams possible didn't even earn a line in the footnotes. At home, I placed the book on the table beside mine, a short stack of workshop drafts, essays I'd started but never finished. My name was printed in the upper corner of each page, black ink on bright white, unpublished, undistributed, still mine. I made tea, slow and deliberate, like the act might settle something in my stomach. The kitchen window was streaked with rain. The kettle hissed. I sat on the couch, the book in my lap, and read every page like I was watching someone else's childhood. His version was charming, a touch dramatic, the kind of story people like to hear. In his telling, I was a gentle background character, reliable, flat, silent, a pause between paragraphs. Somewhere around chapter 8, my mind wandered. I laid the book down beside mine, its spine lined up perfectly next to my unopened folder. For a moment, I looked at the two objects side by side, his published truth and mine not yet written. I opened my laptop to check my email, but a notification popped up first, a podcast link shared in the family group chat. The caption read, "Our Caleb featured on NPR this morning." I clicked it. The host was warm and easy to listen to. Caleb sounded relaxed, rehearsed. He spoke about the creative process, about being vulnerable on the page, about finding his voice after years of silence. Then the host asked, "Who made you believe you could do this?" He laughed softly. "Honestly, my mom. She raised dreamers. She believed in art and heart and all that messy stuff." No mention of his sister. I didn't finish the episode. I didn't reply to the group chat. I didn't explain my silence. Instead, I opened the chat settings, scrolled down, and tapped Leave Group. A prompt appeared. "Are you sure you want to leave this conversation?" Yes. It wasn't out of anger, not this time. I had nothing to prove, nothing to reclaim, no seat at the table I still needed to fight for. I deleted the family group chat, not out of anger, out of clarity. The voicemail came while I was rinsing dishes. I heard it ping from the living room, a soft vibration against the wood console. I let it wait. The water was warm, not hot, and the last of the soap bubbles slid around the rim of a chipped mug I'd been meaning to replace. Later, with the sink empty and the towel hung just right, I picked up the phone and pressed play. "Hi, sweetheart. It's Mom again. Sorry to bother you. The water heater's acting up. Again." Caleb tried to look at it, but, he's not exactly handy. I'm just not sure what we'll do if it goes out entirely. Anyway, if you have a second, maybe you could call the plumber we used before. You always know who to call. Hope you're well. Her voice had that measured lilt, like a teacup on a saucer, trying to sound light but careful not to clatter. 12 years ago, I'd paid to replace that very heater after Caleb's startup flopped, and he moved back in. I'd hired the contractor. I'd stayed late at the house to sign the form. I'd even brought soup. I deleted the voicemail. Sunlight sliced through the blinds in long, golden stripes. I sat down at the table where the notepad still held my scribbles from the week before. Lisbon had a star next to it now. I added another. That afternoon, I walked to Grace's. Her backyard was quiet except for the breeze brushing through the fence ivy and the rustle of a few stubborn leaves falling from the plum tree. She'd already set the table with 2 mugs and a steaming thermos. "Peppermint today," she said, smiling without standing. Felt right. I sank into the chair beside her. "You ever feel like the only way to fix your life is to stop fixing everyone else's?" "All the time," she said gently, pouring. "But knowing and doing are 2 very different things." "I listened to her voicemail," I said. She was polite, kind of soft. She's good at that, sounding like she's asking, when really she's assigning. Grace didn't answer right away. Instead, she handed me a small envelope. "Before I forget, that poem I mentioned." I took it, slipped the flap open. It was 1 page, lightly creased, typed in an old font I didn't recognize. No title, just a few stanzas. She'd signed it at the bottom with a tiny blue heart next to her name. "I self-published it once," she said. 1 copy, no launch party, no marketing. It didn't need applause. I held the paper in both hands. "Why are you giving it to me?" "Because I think you know what it's like to build something that no one claps for." She wasn't talking about poetry. The sun dipped lower. Light shifted from gold to silver, and a chill moved in beneath the table. I tucked the poem into my jacket pocket and looked at her. "You ever want to slam the door?" I asked. "Make a big exit, one they'll remember." "Sometimes," she admitted, "but usually I just leave it open enough to remind them I could have stayed." We sat in silence for a while, sipping tea that cooled faster than we could drink it. When I got home, I went to the drawer where I kept the old checkbook. I hadn't written from it in years. Everything was digital now, but it still sat there, as if waiting for permission to be obsolete. I opened it and flipped through the carbon copies. Tuition, rent, utility, emergency dentist for Caleb, one Thanksgiving grocery run, each line like a ledger of small erasures. Inside the cover was a yellow sticky note. I had forgotten about it. It was written in my own handwriting. "You've done enough." I didn't remember when I wrote it, but reading it now, it felt like a message from a version of me that had been waiting patiently to be heard. I put the note on the table. Then I fed the checkbook page by page into the shredder. The sound was steady, not violent, just final, like closing a drawer for the last time. No one clapped, no one knew, and yet I felt more seen than I had in years. Later that evening, I made tea. Real tea. Loose leaves. Infuser. A splash of milk. I set the mug down gently on a coaster that had once belonged to my father. The steam rose in quiet spirals. I didn't check my phone. I didn't feel guilty, and I didn't feel the need to apologize for drinking it alone. I stood outside the glass-paneled room on the second floor of the library, holding nothing but my coat in one hand and a pen in the other. The building smelled like old pages and winter coats, faintly dusty, comfortingly quiet, the kind of quiet that invites thought, not silence. Inside, half a dozen people sat in a loose circle of chairs. Some held notebooks. Others had loose sheets in their laps. One woman in her 60s was knitting. Nina looked up, saw me through the glass, and smiled. Not a big wave or beckon, just a simple nod, like she knew I was always going to come in. I just hadn't known it yet. I took a deep breath and opened the door. The room was warm. Someone had brought cookies. Another person was pouring tea from a thermos into paper cups. Nina stood, pulled a chair beside hers, and said, "We're just getting started." I nodded. I sat. I didn't say anything. Introductions were brief, gentle. The group wasn't about publishing or critique, just voices, just presence. When it was my turn, I unfolded a single printed page from my coat pocket. I had typed it at home earlier that morning, not obsessively, not carefully, just honestly. The title read, "What I Never Said." My voice wavered for the first few words, then it didn't. When someone writes your story without your permission, you have two choices. You can stay quiet and let the version live without you, or you can write back, not louder, not angrier, just truer. The room was still. I continued reading, a paragraph about a lemon bar left untouched, a sentence about applause that never landed, a single memory of holding a checkbook like a lifeline and realizing I was the one keeping everyone afloat. When I finished, I looked up. No one clapped. No one rushed to fill the silence. Then a woman across from me, curly gray hair, eyes soft, said, "Thank you." Nothing more. And somehow it was enough. Afterward, people trickled out, chatting quietly, folding their notes. Nina stayed beside me, holding her cup with both hands. "You came," she said. "I wasn't sure I would." I was. We walked out together. The air outside was crisp, but the sun was trying its best. The city moved on around us. Buses groaned, crosswalks beeped. Someone laughed too loudly across the street. Life, unbothered. At the corner, I paused beside a bus stop. A poster on the shelter showed Caleb's face. His book had been picked for a citywide reading campaign. The tagline beneath read, "A memoir of hope, grit, and forgiveness." I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked away. Not bitter, not broken, just done. At home, I made tea and turned on the lamp beside my writing chair, the one that had mostly held folded laundry until now. I opened my phone, tapped New Document, and titled it Chapter 1. I didn't need applause. I needed a room quiet enough to hear myself think, and a blank page that didn't ask permission. That morning at the library, I finally gave myself both. Sometimes, the greatest act of love isn't holding things together. It's choosing to let go of what was never ours to carry. Family doesn't always come with fairness, but our voice can. And even if no one else claps, telling our own truth is a kind of standing ovation. If this story reminded you of someone you used to be or someone you're becoming, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Maybe it's time we all started writing Chapter 1,